The words cut deeper than the November wind whipping across the Montana plains. My brother Ryan stood in our childhood kitchen, champagne glass raised, his voice carrying that particular tone of victory he'd perfected over 34 years. $100,000 for a house, he announced, while I got 40 acres of rocks and regret. Our mother actually applauded. Our aunts nodded approvingly. And me? I stood there holding the deed to land everyone called worthless, feeling the weight of family disappointment settle on my shoulders like fresh snow. What none of them knew, what I was only beginning to discover, was that my father hadn't left me wasteland. He'd left me a fortune buried in plain sight, and a truth that would shake our family to its very foundation. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances don't come wrapped in dollar signs. They come wrapped in faith. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The attorney's office felt like a place where hope went to die. James Thornton had practiced law in Copper Ridge for 40 years, and his office reflected every single one of them. Dark wood paneling absorbed the weak afternoon light. Leather chairs cracked at the seams exhaled dust when you sat down. The whole place smelled of old paper and older promises, the kind that got written in careful script and filed away in metal cabinets that lined the walls like silent witnesses to decades of family drama. I arrived early, as I always did, my hands wrapped around a to-go cup from the Copper Cup even though the coffee had gone cold during my anxious wait in the parking lot. Through the window I'd watched Ryan pull up in his new Range Rover, black and gleaming, the kind of vehicle that announced success before its driver even stepped out. He'd been on his phone, laughing at something, his movements easy and confident. He belonged in rooms like this. I felt like an imposter. My father had been gone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the heart attack took him on a Sunday morning while he was out at Ravens Peak Valley, that stretch of land he'd loved for reasons none of us understood. They found him near the old survey shack, his worn compass still in his hand, his face turned toward the rising sun. The doctor said it was instant, that he felt nothing, but I wondered if in that final moment he'd thought about what he was leaving behind, and whether he knew what would happen when his carefully laid plans finally came to light. Ryan swept into the office 15 minutes late, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and the energy of a man who had places to be. His suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. His watch definitely did. He kissed our mother Patricia on the cheek where she sat already positioned in the chair closest to Thornton's desk, and he clapped me on the shoulder in that way he had, the gesture that could be read as either affection or dismissal depending on your generosity of interpretation. Our mother looked smaller than I remembered, though only 6 weeks had passed. Grief had carved new lines around her mouth, but her posture remained perfect, her silver hair styled exactly as it always was, her disapproval of my jeans and sweater radiating across the space between us without a single word being spoken. She'd made it clear at the funeral that she thought my decision to take a leave from my job at the environmental research firm was dramatic and unnecessary. Ryan had taken 2 days off and returned to his development company. Why couldn't I be more like him? James Thornton entered through the side door, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who'd learned that rushing never improved difficult conversations. He carried a manila folder and a sealed envelope, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. He'd known my father well. They'd served together on the town planning commission. They'd had coffee every Thursday morning for a decade. And now he had the unenviable task of distributing what remained of Robert Walker's life among the people who'd loved him, or claimed to. He settled into his chair with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and weary. For a moment, he simply looked at us, his weathered face unreadable. Then he opened the folder and began to read in that particular tone attorneys use, the one that strips emotion from words and reduces love and loss to legal terminology. The will was straightforward in its structure, if devastating in its implications. To Patricia Walker, the family home and a life insurance policy that would keep her comfortable. Some investments, some savings, the kind of financial security that 50 years of careful living provides. My mother nodded, unsurprised. This was expected, appropriate, proper. To Ryan Walker, $100,000, designated specifically for the purchase of his first home. No restrictions, no conditions, just a father's blessing translated into a down payment on the American dream. Ryan's smile was small but satisfied, The expression of a man whose assumptions about his place in the family hierarchy had just been confirmed. Our mother reached over and squeezed his hand, pride evident in every line of her face. And then Thornton's voice shifted just slightly as he came to my name. To Emma Walker, I leave the entirety of the Ravens Peak Valley property, consisting of 40 acres, all structures thereon, and all contents contained within said structures. Furthermore, I leave her my surveying equipment, my field notes, and my compass. May she find what I always knew was there. The silence that followed had texture and weight. It pressed against my eardrums and made my heart beat too fast. 40 acres of scrubland. A falling down shack. Some rusty equipment. Compared to Ryan's clean, simple $100,000, it sounded like exactly what it was. A consolation prize. Pat on the head. Here, Emma, have the thing nobody wants. Ryan laughed. It started as a chuckle, low and almost apologetic, but it grew until it filled the office, bouncing off the wood paneling and the leather chairs and the metal filing cabinets. He wasn't being cruel, not intentionally. That was almost worse. His laughter was genuine amusement at the absurdity of it, at the cosmic joke of our father leaving his daughter rocks and dirt while his son got the foundation for a future. I'm sorry, he said, trying to compose himself, wiping at his eyes. I'm sorry, Em, I don't mean to laugh. It's just God, Dad really did love that wasteland, didn't he? Maybe you can, I don't know, go camping out there? Make it a meditation retreat? You're into that environmental stuff. Maybe there's some endangered beetle or something you can protect. Our mother made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been suppressed laughter of her own. She'd never understood why my father spent his weekends at Ravens Peak. She'd called it his midlife crisis, his expensive hobby, his excuse to avoid social obligations. The land had been a point of tension in their marriage, one of those small fractures that never quite heals but gets papered over by decades of compromise and routine. James Thornton's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes as he watched me. He slid an envelope across the desk, my name written on it in my father's precise handwriting. This was left for you specifically, Emma. He asked that you read it privately. I took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, hating that my family could see the emotion I was trying so hard to contain. Ryan was already standing, already checking his phone, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. Our mother was gathering her purse, her face set in that expression I knew so well, the one that meant we would not be discussing feelings or disappointments or anything that might disturb the careful surface of family propriety. In the parking lot, as cold wind cut through my jacket and sent leaves skittering across the pavement, Ryan gave me an actual hug, the kind that felt genuine. Look, he said, his hands on my shoulders, his face earnest. I know it seems like you got the short end here, but Dad was old-fashioned. He probably figured I needed the help getting established, and you'd be fine with something sentimental. You were always his little nature girl, right? Maybe he thought you'd appreciate the land more than money. The generosity in his interpretation made something crack inside my chest. He actually believed what he was saying. He wasn't trying to minimize my inheritance out of cruelty. He genuinely thought our father had given me a meaningful gift, just one that happened to have no practical value whatsoever. In Ryan's world, that made sense. The successful son gets the investment. The dreamy daughter gets the symbol. Our mother kissed my cheek, her lips dry and cool. You'll figure out what to do with it, she said, in the tone one uses to encourage a child who's brought home a disappointing report card. Maybe you can sell it eventually. Someone might want it for hunting or something. I watched them drive away together, Ryan's Range Rover carrying them toward dinner at the nice restaurant on Main Street, the one with white tablecloths and a wine list. I wasn't invited. It was assumed I'd want to be alone to process, to come to terms with my place in the family's financial hierarchy. And they were right, but not for the reasons they thought. I sat in my old Subaru, the heater struggling against the November cold, and opened the envelope with fingers that felt clumsy and thick. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, and something small and heavy wrapped in cloth. I unfolded the paper first. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma, my father had written, if you're reading this, you've just heard the will, and you're probably feeling like I let you down. Your brother got money. You got dirt. I imagine Ryan laughed. I imagine your mother looked sympathetic but disappointed. I I imagine you're sitting somewhere alone right now, wondering what you did wrong, why you weren't worth the same investment. My vision blurred, tears coming hot and unexpected. He'd known. He'd known exactly how this would play. You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. You did everything right. You're the one who came with me to Raven's Peak. You're the one who asked questions about the rock formations and the sediment layers. You're the one who listened when I talked about what the land was trying to tell us. Ryan saw dirt. You saw story. That's why the land goes to you. I'm not a man of many words, never have been. Your mother used to joke that I saved them all up from my survey notes. But I need you to understand something. The land at Raven's Peak isn't worthless. It never was. I've spent 15 years documenting what's there, and I've left you everything you need to understand what I found. Go to the shack. Start with the north wall. Trust the compass. You're going to be tempted to tell Ryan to share this with the family, to try to make peace by dividing whatever you discover. Don't. Not yet. Some people need to learn that value isn't always obvious, and some lessons can only be taught by time and consequence. Your brother is a good man, but he's built his life on surfaces. You understand foundations. That's the difference, and that's why this is yours. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I'm not there to see your face when you finally understand what I've given you. Trust yourself, Emma. You've always had better instincts than you believed. The cloth-wrapped object was his compass, the one he'd carried for 40 years, the one that had been in his hand when he died. It was brass heavy, worn smooth by decades of use. When I opened it, the needle swung true, pointing north with absolute certainty. I cried then, really cried, my forehead against the steering wheel, my breath fogging the windows. Not because I felt sorry for myself, but because for the first time since the funeral, I felt my father's presence like a physical thing. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't chosen Ryan over me. He'd given me exactly what he thought I was ready to receive, and he'd had faith that I would understand. The drive from Copper Ridge to Raven's Peak Valley took 20 minutes on a good day, longer when the roads were slick with early snow. I drove it that evening as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the day I'd had. The road wound through pine forests and past ranches where cattle stood like dark sculptures against the fading light. I passed the turnoff to Ryan's new development project, the sign promising luxury mountain living starting in the low millions, and felt something twist in my stomach. Raven's Peak Valley opened up suddenly, the way Montana landscapes do. All that space and sky and silence rushing at you like a physical force. The 40 acres sat at the base of the actual peak, a rocky outcrop that gave the area its name. To someone driving past, it looked exactly like what Ryan had called it. Wasteland. The ground was rocky and uneven, covered in sparse grass and stubborn sage. A few twisted pines clung to existence where there was enough soil. The survey shack hunched near the center of the property, its wood weathered to gray, its single window dark. I'd been here countless times as a child, trailing after my father as he walked the property with his instruments, taking measurements I didn't understand, making notes in leather journals he kept in the shack. He tried to explain what he was doing, talking about geological surveys and mineral composition and sediment analysis, but I'd been more interested in the ravens that nested in the peak's crevices, the way the wind sounded different here than anywhere else, the strange beauty of a landscape that refused to be pretty. The shack's door stuck, swollen with moisture and time, but it gave way with a hard shove. Inside, the air was cold and still, smelling of dust and old paper. And something mineral and deep. My father's presence saturated the space. His jacket still hung on a hook by the door. His coffee mug sat on the workbench, a ring of old coffee dried in the bottom. Maps covered the walls, geological surveys and topographical charts layered over each other like archaeological strata. The workbench held his equipment, transits and levels and soil sample containers, all neatly arranged and covered in months of dust. I stood in the center of that small space and felt the weight of what he'd left me. Not just land but a life's work. Not just rocks but a mystery he'd spent 15 years documenting. And somewhere in this shack, hidden like all his other treasures, was the answer to what made 40 acres of Montana scrubland worth more than $100,000 in cash. The north wall, he'd written. Start with the north wall. I oriented myself using the compass, feeling slightly foolish but committed. The north wall was covered in maps, but beneath them, I could see the rough wood planks. I started pulling maps down carefully, revealing more wood, more nothing. It took 30 minutes and growing frustration before I noticed it. One plank, about 3 feet up from the floor, had a slightly different color than the others, as if it had been replaced or refinished separately. I pressed against it and it gave slightly, hinged at the bottom. Behind it was a gap in the insulation, and in that gap was a metal box, the kind fireproof safes come in, small and heavy. My heart hammered as I pulled it out and set it on the workbench. It wasn't locked. Inside were 3 leather journals, their covers soft with age, filled with my father's meticulous handwriting and careful diagrams. Beneath them, a folder of official-looking documents with seals and signatures. And on top, a USB drive with my name written on a piece of tape. I sat on the floor with the box in my lap as darkness fell completely outside, using my phone's flashlight to read. The journals documented 15 years of geological surveys, core samples, mineral assays, careful measurements of depth and distribution, technical language I barely understood but could sense the importance of. And again, circled and underlined and emphasized 2 words: rare earth. The documents were mining rights, mineral rights, carefully transferred and notarized over the years, partnerships with exploration companies, letters from geologists at the Montana Bureau of Mines, assay results that meant nothing to me in their specifics but everything in their tone, significant deposits, commercial viability, estimated value pending further analysis. My hand shook as I read one letter, dated 18 months before my father's death. Mr. Walker, your suspicions have been confirmed by our analysis. The lithium deposits alone are substantial, potentially in the range of $40 to $60 million at current market values. The rare earth elements present additional value, particularly the dysprosium and terbium. We would very much like to discuss a partnership for extraction and development. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. $40 to $60 million. The words swam before my eyes. I read them again, certain I'd misunderstood, but the numbers remained stubbornly unchanged. My father had known. He'd known for at least 18 months that this wasteland, this joke, this disappointing inheritance, was sitting on a fortune. And he'd said nothing. He'd let Ryan develop his luxury houses. He'd let our mother dismiss the land as a hobby. He'd let everyone think he was an eccentric old man who couldn't let go of a bad investment. All while he methodically documented proof that would change everything. The USB drive held one file, a video dated 3 months before his death. I had to watch it on my phone, the small screen inadequate for the moment. My father's face appeared, older and thinner than I wanted to remember, sitting in this very shack with these very maps behind him. His eyes were tired but clear, and when he smiled it was sad and knowing and full of a love that made my throat close. Emma, he said, his voice rough the way it got when he was emotional. If you're watching this, you found the journals and you know what's under this land. I imagine you're pretty shocked. I imagine you're wondering why I kept it secret, why I didn't develop it myself, why I'm leaving it all to you instead of splitting it with Ryan. He paused, looking down at his hands, gathering his thoughts the way he always did. Your brother is a good man. I love him. But he's built his life on taking the easy path, on choosing the obvious value, on going for the quick win. He sees a piece of land and imagines what he can build on top of it. You see a piece of land and wonder what's already there, waiting to be understood. When you were 10 years old, you asked me why some rocks sparkled and others didn't. Ryan would have said it's because some rocks are prettier. You wanted to know the geology, the mineralogy, the actual reason. That's the difference between you, sweetheart. Ryan sees surfaces. You see depth. This land has depth. Literal depth, as you now know, but also the kind that matters more. It's taught me patience. It's taught me that the most valuable things are usually the ones people overlook because they're not immediately obvious. It's taught me that sometimes you have to wait years to understand what something is really worth. I'm leaving it to you because I know you'll approach it with respect. You won't just see dollar signs, though there are plenty of those. You'll see responsibility. You'll think about what extracting these minerals means for the land, for the environment, for the community. You'll do the research. You'll make the careful choice, not the easy one. Ryan got money because money is what he understands and what he needs. You got something harder. You got trust. You got responsibility. You got the thing I spent half my life understanding. And I absolutely know that you'll do right by it. He leaned closer to the camera, his expression intense. You're going to be tempted to tell everyone immediately. You're going to want to prove you weren't given the lesser inheritance. You're going to want to show Ryan and your mother that they were wrong about the land's value. Resist that temptation, Emma. Sit with this for a while. Learn what you have. Understand the full picture before you share it. And when Ryan finds out, because he will eventually remember this, his reaction will tell you everything you need to know about who he's become. Some people celebrate others' good fortune. Some people resent it. You'll know which one he is by how he responds to your success. I love you, sweetheart. I'm so proud of who you've become. And I'm sorry I won't be there to see what you build with this gift. But I absolutely know it will be something that matters. The video ended. I sat in the darkness of the shack, my phone's dying battery casting the only light, and felt the full weight of what my father had done. He hadn't just left me land. He'd left me a test for myself and a revelation about my family. He'd left me the raw material for a future I couldn't yet imagine, and the faith that I was capable of imagining it. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the shack's walls and sending something skittering across the roof. In the distance, a raven called, its voice harsh and wild. I held my father's compass in one hand and felt its weight, its certainty, its absolute conviction about which direction was true. For the first time since his death, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. And underneath that, growing stronger with every heartbeat, I felt anger. Not at my father, but at everyone who'd laughed, who'd pitied me, who'd assumed that because something didn't look valuable, it wasn't. My brother had gotten $100,000 and the family's approval. I'd gotten $40 million and a choice about what kind of person I was going to be. Only one of us had received an inheritance that would actually change our life. Ryan just didn't know it yet. I spent that first night in the shack, unable to bring myself to leave. The temperature dropped to near freezing, and I wrapped myself in my father's old jacket, breathing in the faint scent of his aftershave and the mineral dust that permeated everything he owned. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the wind and the weight of knowledge, and the strange electricity of standing on the edge of a life that was about to transform completely. By dawn, I'd read through all 3 journals twice, my phone's flashlight growing dimmer with each page. My father's handwriting told a story of patience and persistence that made my chest ache. The first entries dated back 17 years, long before he'd even purchased the land. He'd been hiking in the area, noticed unusual coloring in the exposed rock faces, collected samples out of pure curiosity. The early entries were almost casual, the notes of a man indulging a hobby. But as years progressed, the tone shifted. The observations became more systematic, the language more technical, the implications more significant. He'd had the first samples analyzed at the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, paying out of pocket, telling no one. When the results came back showing trace elements of lithium and rare earth minerals, he'd purchased the land quietly, through a holding company, so the price wouldn't inflate. Then he'd spent years documenting the full extent of the deposits, bringing in core samples, mapping the subsurface geology, building an irrefutable case for what lay beneath 40 acres of scrubland that everyone assumed was worthless. The methodical nature of it staggered me. My father had been a surveyor, a man who measured property lines and calculated elevations, steady work that paid the bills but never made anyone rich. This project had been something else entirely. This had been vision. This had been faith in his own observations despite having no formal geology training. This had been the quiet rebellion of a man who'd spent his whole life being practical, finally allowing himself to chase something extraordinary. I thought about all the weekends he'd spent out here, the way my mother had rolled her eyes and made comments about his expensive hobby. I thought about the surveying equipment I'd assumed was for his regular work, now understanding it had been repurposed for something far more significant. I thought about the way he'd invited me along, how patient he'd been with my questions, how he'd taught me to really look at the land instead of just seeing the surface. You have to read the earth, Emma, he'd say, crouched beside an exposed rock face, running his calloused fingers over stone. Everything has a story if you know how to listen. See these layers? Each one is a different time, a different climate, a different set of circumstances. The earth keeps records better than any library. I thought he was being poetic. Now I understood he'd been teaching me the literal skill I'd need to comprehend what he was leaving behind. Every lesson had been preparation. Every patient explanation had been an investment in a future where he wouldn't be here to guide me. The realization made tears sting my eyes again. But this time they were mixed with something fiercer. Gratitude and determination braided together into something that felt almost like courage. As pale sunlight filtered through the shack's grimy window, I pulled out my laptop and used my phone as a hotspot. The signal weak but functional. I started researching everything I could find about rare earth elements, lithium mining, market values, extraction methods, environmental impacts. The information was overwhelming and technical, but I forced myself to read slowly, to take notes, to build a foundation of understanding. Lithium was used in batteries, the kind that powered electric vehicles and stored renewable energy. The demand was skyrocketing as the world shifted away from fossil fuels. Rare earth elements, despite their name, weren't actually that rare. But they were difficult to extract and process, and the global supply was dominated by China. The United States was desperate for domestic sources. Montana had a history of mining, infrastructure already in place, political will to support domestic mineral development. The numbers made my head spin. Conservative estimates suggested the lithium alone could be worth $40 million. The rare earth elements, particularly the heavy rare earths like dysprosium and terbium that my father's assays had identified, could add another 20 to 30 million. We weren't talking about a nice windfall. We were talking about generational wealth. We were talking about the kind of money that fundamentally altered every calculation about what was possible in life. I thought about my studio apartment in Copper Ridge, the one I could barely afford on my researcher's salary. I thought about my student loans, still substantial despite years of payments. I thought about the used Subaru that needed new tires and made a concerning sound when I accelerated too quickly. I thought about every time I declined to join friends for dinner because I was watching my budget, every opportunity I passed on because I couldn't afford the risk. Then I thought about Ryan's Range Rover, his downtown condo in Billings, his tailored suits and expensive watches. I thought about how he'd laughed in the attorney's office, genuinely amused by the cosmic joke of our father leaving me dirt while blessing him with a house down payment. I thought about my mother's sympathetic expression, the way she'd patted my hand like I was a child who needed comfort after coming in last at the school field day. The anger that rose in me wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and clear and focused. They'd underestimated me my entire life. They'd assumed that quiet meant weak, that thoughtful meant indecisive, that different priorities meant lesser ambition. They'd looked at my father's gift to me and seen exactly what they expected to see because they'd never bothered to look deeper. Well, I thought, closing my laptop as morning light strengthened outside, they were about to learn an expensive lesson about assumptions. But my father's warning echoed in my mind. Don't rush to tell them. Sit with this. Understand it fully first. He'd been right about so much already. I needed to trust that he was right about this too. I needed to resist the immediate gratification of proving everyone wrong, and instead do the harder work of building something real with what he'd given me. I spent the next 2 weeks living a double life. On the surface, I was Emma Walker, the disappointing daughter who'd inherited worthless scrubland and was trying to figure out what to do with it. I showed up at family dinners at my mother's house, smiled politely when relatives asked if I'd decided to sell the land yet, listened to Ryan talk about his development projects and his plans for the house he'd buy with his inheritance. He'd already been pre-approved for a mortgage, he announced over pot roast one Sunday. With Dad's $100,000 as a down payment, he could afford something really impressive. He was looking at properties in the new development west of Billings, the one with the golf course and the mountain views. For bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. He showed us pictures on his phone, swiping through listings with the enthusiasm of someone whose dreams were coming true exactly on schedule. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," our mother said, her voice warm with pride. "Your father would be so happy to see you settled in a proper home." The implication hung unspoken. Ryan was building a proper life. Ryan was making something of himself. Ryan was the kind of son who made a father's investment worthwhile. I was the one with 40 acres of nothing, still renting, still uncertain, still unable to demonstrate the kind of concrete success that impressed Patricia Walker. "What about you, Em?" Ryan asked, generosity in his voice because he could afford to be generous. He'd won. "Have you thought about what you'll do with the land? I mean, I know Dad loved it, but you can't eat sentiment. Maybe I could help you list it?" I know some agents who specialize in rural properties. I smiled and said I was thinking about it, that I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet, that I wanted to spend some time out there first to feel close to Dad. It was the perfect response, exactly what they expected from sentimental, impractical Emma. Ryan nodded sympathetically. Our mother looked vaguely concerned that I was going to turn into some kind of hermit, but she didn't push. What they didn't see was the work I was doing in every spare moment. I'd contacted Dr. Diane Foster, one of the geologists my father had worked with, whose name appeared repeatedly in his journals. She agreed to meet me at Ravens Peak, curiosity evident in her voice when I'd called. She was in her early 60s, weathered and direct, with the kind of competence that came from decades of fieldwork. She'd known my father for years, she explained as we walked the property, had been fascinated by what he was documenting. Robert was one of the most patient researchers I've ever worked with, she said, kneeling to examine an exposed section of rock. Most people want instant results, instant gratification. Your father understood that the earth reveals itself slowly. He took his time, did everything right, built a bulletproof case for what's here. She confirmed what the journals had documented. The deposits were substantial, well-distributed, relatively accessible compared to some rare earth sites. The lithium was particularly promising, high-grade material in a geological formation that would make extraction more straightforward than many deposits. The rare earth elements were a bonus, valuable enough to justify their own separate extraction if the lithium proved economically viable on its own. What's it worth? I asked, trying to sound casual, as if the answer wouldn't determine the entire trajectory of my future. Dr. Foster stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked at me with sharp eyes that seemed to assess more than just geological curiosity. That depends on a lot of factors, she said carefully. Market prices fluctuate. Extraction costs vary depending on the method. Environmental regulations affect the timeline and expense. But conservatively, if you partnered with the right mining company and negotiated a reasonable royalty structure, you're looking at somewhere between 50 and 80 million over the life of the mine. Maybe more if prices continue trending upward. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like talking about the distance to stars. $50 to $80 million. From land that Ryan had laughed about, that my mother suggested I sell for whatever I could get, that everyone assumed was the booby prize in the inheritance lottery. Your father wanted you to have options, Dr. Foster continued. He was very clear about that in our conversations. He didn't want you to feel pressured into any particular approach. You could sell the mineral rights outright and walk away with a substantial lump sum. You could lease them and collect royalties over time. You could even partner in the extraction itself if you wanted that level of involvement. The important thing is that you take your time and make the choice that aligns with your values. My values. It was the first time anyone had suggested that I might have values worth considering when it came to something this significant. Ryan made decisions based on ROI and market trends. Our mother made decisions based on what looked respectable to her social circle. But my father had apparently believed I would make decisions based on something deeper, something that would require actually thinking about what mattered beyond just maximum profit. I spent another week researching mining companies, reading environmental impact studies, learning about sustainable extraction methods and community benefit agreements. The more I learned, the more complex the decision became. Mining was inherently disruptive. Even the most responsible operations scarred the land, used tremendous amounts of water, created waste that had to be managed for decades. But the materials themselves were crucial for the transition away from fossil fuels. The lithium would power electric vehicles. The rare earth elements would go into wind turbines and solar panels and the technologies that might actually slow climate change. There was no perfect choice, I realized. There was only the choice I could live with, the one that balanced competing values in a way that let me sleep at night. And unlike my brother, who would have seen only the dollar signs and moved as quickly as possible to maximize profit, I actually had the luxury of time to think it through. The minerals weren't going anywhere. The land was mine, free and clear. Could afford to be deliberate. It was during this period, 3 weeks after the will reading, that I started noticing the truck. It appeared first at the end of the access road to Ravens Peak, a dark blue pickup that didn't belong to any of the neighboring ranchers. I'd driven past it twice before I registered it as unusual. The third time I saw it, it was parked closer to the property line, and I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, watching the land through binoculars. A cold finger of unease traced down my spine. I called Dr. Foster that evening, described what I'd seen. Her response was immediate and sharp. Don't go out to the property alone anymore. If someone's watching, they might have an idea of what's there. Your father was discreet, but word has a way of getting around in geology circles. There are people who track this kind of thing, who look for opportunities to acquire valuable mineral rights before the owners understand what they have. But I haven't told anyone, I protested. I've been so careful. Your father talked to several mining companies, she reminded me. He had assays done. He worked with consultants. Any one of those connections could have mentioned it to someone else. It only takes one loose conversation for the wrong people to start paying attention. I thought about the documents in the shack, the journals, the evidence of what lay beneath the scrubland. If someone broke in, if they found what I'd found, they could use that information to try to acquire the land through whatever means available. A generous offer that seemed like more than scrubland was worth. Legal pressure. Harassment. The tools available to people who understood the value of something and were willing to exploit an owner who might not. The next morning, I moved everything important from the shack to a safety deposit box at Copper Ridge Community Bank. The journals, the assay results, the mineral rights documentation, the USB drive with my father's video. I kept only copies for my own reference, hidden in places that wouldn't be obvious to anyone searching the shack. If someone did break in, they'd find surveying equipment and old maps, and nothing that explicitly revealed the land's true value. But the truck continued to appear, and I continued to feel watched. It was unnerving in a way I hadn't anticipated, this sense of being tracked, of having something valuable that others wanted. For the first time, I understood why my father had kept everything so quiet. Knowledge was power, but it was also vulnerability. The moment you revealed what you had, you became a target. I was so focused on the external threat that I didn't notice the internal one developing until it was almost too late. It started innocently enough. Ryan called one evening, his voice casual and friendly. Hey, I was thinking about Dad's land. Before you decide to sell it, maybe I should take a look? I might know some buyers who'd be interested, and I could help you negotiate a fair price. Family discount on the commission. Something in his tone set off alarm bells. A particular quality of forced casualness that I'd learned to recognize over 34 years of being his sister. Ryan only sounded that relaxed when he was maneuvering toward something he wanted. But I kept my own voice light and said, sure, that would be nice. Maybe we could drive out there together this weekend. We met at the property on Saturday morning. The November sky heavy with the threat of snow. Ryan arrived in his Range Rover, wearing jeans and a quilted jacket that probably cost more than my monthly rent, looking like he was dressed for a photo shoot about affluent outdoor lifestyles. He walked the land with me, hands in his pockets, commenting on the view, the quiet, the kind of buyer who might want this kind of space. You could market this as a private retreat, he said, his eyes scanning the property with professional assessment. Some wealthy guy from Billings who wants a place to escape. Maybe put in a nicer cabin, drill a proper well, bring in utilities. The bones are good, The location's actually pretty solid. You might get more than you think. I made non-committal sounds, watching him carefully. He seemed genuinely helpful, genuinely interested in ensuring I got a fair deal. But there was something in the way he looked at the land, a particular kind of attention that felt more intense than the situation warranted. When we reached the survey shack, he asked if he could look inside, said he was curious what Dad had kept out here all those years. I unlocked the door, my heart beating faster than it should. I'd removed anything incriminating, but I still felt anxious as Ryan moved through the small space, examining the maps on the walls, the equipment on the workbench, the general accumulation of a decades-long project. He picked up one of the soil sample containers, turned it over in his hands, set it down. He studied the maps, traced routes with his finger, asked questions about what the different markings meant. Dad was really into this stuff, wasn't he? Ryan said, a note of something I couldn't quite identify in his voice. All this measuring and mapping and analyzing. Must have spent thousands of hours out here. Kind of obsessive, honestly. He loved the land, I said simply, not taking the bait. He found it peaceful. Ryan nodded, still looking around, still searching for something I couldn't name. Then he said almost too casually, before you sell you might want to have a mineral survey done. Just to make sure there's nothing valuable underneath. There probably isn't, but it would be due diligence. Help you price it right. My blood ran cold. A mineral survey. Why would Ryan suggest that unless he suspected there was something to find? I kept my expression neutral, interested but not alarmed. That's a good idea, I said. I'll look into it. Do you know anyone who does that kind of work? I have some contacts, he said, and now his smile was definitely sharper than before. I could make some calls if you want. Get you a fair assessment. We left the shack together, and Ryan talked about next steps, about marketing strategies and pricing tiers and optimal timing for listing rural properties. But I barely heard him. My mind was racing, trying to understand how much he knew or suspected, and where the information had come from. Had someone from one of the mining companies talked? Had Dr. Foster mentioned something to the wrong person? Had my father's discretion failed in some way I hadn't anticipated? Or had Ryan simply developed the instinct that comes from years of property development, the ability to sense when something valuable was being overlooked? He'd built his career on finding undervalued properties, seeing potential others missed, moving quickly to capitalize before the market caught up. Had he looked at the land our father left me and wondered why someone as methodical as Robert Walker would spend so much time on something truly worthless? After Ryan left, I sat in my Subaru and called. Dr. Foster told her about the conversation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Your brother suspects something. I don't know how much, but he's fishing. You need to move faster than you planned, Emma. File the mineral rights claims, establish clear legal ownership, get everything locked down before he starts digging deeper." "But I'm not ready," I protested. "I haven't decided what I want to do yet." "Then decide," she said, not unkindly but with unmistakable urgency. "Because if your brother figures out what's there before you've established clear legal ownership of the mineral rights, things are going to get complicated. Your father left you the land, but mineral rights can be contested, especially if someone can argue they have a legitimate claim, or that the rights were improperly transferred. I'm not saying Ryan would do that, but money makes people do surprising things." I thought about the $100,000 Ryan had inherited, the house he was planning to buy, the life he was building. Then I thought about the $50 to $80 million sitting under land he'd laughed about. Dr. Foster was right. Money made people do surprising things, and I had no idea how far my brother would go to claim what he'd decide should rightfully be his. That night I made the decision. I would file the mineral rights claims immediately, establish unambiguous legal ownership of everything beneath the surface. I would do it quietly without fanfare, but I would do it. And then when everything was secure and irrevocable, when there was no possible way for Ryan or anyone else to challenge my ownership, I would decide what to do with what my father had left me. But I would decide. Not Ryan. Not my mother. Not the mining companies circling like ravens sensing something dead and valuable below. Me. Just like my father had intended. The filing process took 3 days and cost more in legal fees than I was comfortable spending, but James Thornton walked me through it with the same careful precision he'd used for everything related to my father's estate. The mineral rights were filed with the county, publicly recorded but buried in enough legal language that casual observers wouldn't immediately grasp their significance. To anyone looking, it would appear that Emma Walker had simply formalized her ownership of the subsurface rights to property she'd inherited. Standard procedure. Nothing remarkable. But Thornton knew better, and when we finished signing the last document, he looked at me over his reading glasses with something like approval. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "You're being smart about this. Methodical. That's exactly what he hoped you'd be." "You knew," I said, not a question but a statement. "About what was under the land. He told you." Thornton nodded slowly. "He told me enough. Enough to understand why he structured the will the way he did. Enough to know that you were getting far more than anyone realized. He was very specific in his instructions to me, Emma. If your brother or mother asked about the land, I was to say only what was in the will. No elaboration. No hints. He wanted you to have time to understand the full picture before family dynamics complicated things. Did he think Ryan would try to take it?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice finally pushing its way out. Thornton considered this, choosing his words carefully. "I think your father understood that wealth reveals character. He believed you had the character to handle this responsibly. He wanted to give you the chance to prove him right before anyone could challenge or pressure you. As for your brother, Robert loved him. But he knew Ryan's weaknesses as well as his strengths. The will was designed to give each of you exactly what you needed, even if it didn't look equal on the surface. I left Thornton's office with a folder full of legal documents and a weight in my chest that felt like responsibility and fear, and something approaching excitement all braided together. The mineral rights were mine now, unambiguously and irrevocably. Whatever came next, at least I was starting from a position of legal strength. What came next arrived faster than I anticipated. For days after filing the mineral rights, Ryan called again. This time his voice had an edge I'd never heard before. Something sharp and barely controlled. "We need to talk," he said. "In person. Now." My stomach dropped. "What's wrong?" "Just come to my office," he said. "I'll explain when you get here." The Walker Development Group offices occupied the third floor of a modern building in downtown Billings, all glass and steel, and the kind of aggressive contemporary design meant to signal success. I'd only been there once before, shortly after Ryan opened the firm, back when he'd been excited to show me around and introduce me to his staff. That visit felt like it belonged to a different life. A time before wills and mineral rights and the complicated truths that lay beneath 40 acres of Montana scrubland. Ryan's assistant barely looked up when I arrived, just waved me toward his corner office with an expression that suggested family drama was above her pay grade. Through the glass walls I could see Ryan pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing sharply as he talked. When he saw me, he ended the call abruptly and motioned me inside. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing us into the kind of conversation I'd been dreading since the moment I'd opened my father's journals. Ryan didn't offer me a seat. He stood behind his massive desk, his face flushed, his carefully maintained composure fractured in a way I'd rarely seen. "When were you planning to tell me?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "About the lithium? About the fact that Dad's worthless scrubland is apparently sitting on a fortune?" The air in Ryan's office felt thin and sharp, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. I stood there frozen, my mind racing through possibilities of how he'd found out. The mineral rights filing was public record, but you'd have to know where to look and what to look for. Someone had told him. Someone had connected the dots and brought him information he wasn't supposed to have yet. I kept my voice steady, calmer than I felt. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ryan laughed, a sound with no humor in it. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slapped it down on the polished surface hard enough to make me flinch. "Don't lie to me, Emma. I had someone run a title search on Dad's property after our visit last week. Standard procedure when evaluating land. And guess what showed up? A mineral rights claim filed just days ago. For lithium and rare earth elements. So I made some calls, talked to some people in the geology department at Montana Tech, showed them the coordinates. Want to know what they told me?" My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to meet his eyes. "That it's my land and my business what I do with it." His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jump. "Your land? Dad left you that property thinking it was worthless. He gave you dirt and rocks because he felt sorry for you because you were always his little charity case. He gave me actual money, real value because he knew I'd use it responsibly. And now you're telling me that the whole time, he knew there was a fortune buried out there and he just decided I didn't deserve it?" The pain in his voice caught me off guard. Underneath the anger was something rawer. Something that sounded almost like betrayal. Ryan had built his entire identity on being the golden child, the successful son, the one who made his father proud. The idea that Robert Walker had deliberately chosen to give his daughter the more valuable inheritance undermined every assumption Ryan had made about his place in the family hierarchy. "Dad knew exactly what he was doing," I said quietly. "He left you what he thought you needed, and he left me what he thought I could handle. This wasn't about value, Ryan. It was about character." "Character?" Ryan's voice rose, his composure shattering completely. "You think you have better character than me? You who've been sneaking around behind everyone's back, hiding information, filing claims in secret? That's character to you?" "I didn't hide anything," I shot back, my own anger finally surfacing. "I took time to understand what Dad left me before making decisions about it. That's called being thoughtful, not sneaky. And I filed those mineral rights claims to protect what's legally mine, which I have every right to do." "Legally yours," Ryan repeated, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "We'll see about that. Dad wasn't in his right mind those last few months. Everyone knows he was getting forgetful, confused. That will can be contested, Emma. And when a court hears that he left his daughter a fortune while giving his son pocket change, they're going to have questions about his mental competency. The threat hung in the air between us, ugly and unmistakable. I stared at my brother, this man I'd grown up with, who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra homework and walked me down the aisle at my college graduation when Dad's back was too bad to do it. I searched his face for some sign of the person I'd thought he was, but all I could see was calculation and wounded pride and a desperate need to rewrite a narrative he couldn't accept. Dad's mind was perfectly clear, I said, my voice shaking now with rage and hurt. James Thornton will testify to that. Dr. Foster will testify to that. Every single person who worked with him on documenting those mineral deposits will testify that he knew exactly what he was doing and why. You can test that, Will, Ryan, and the only thing you'll accomplish is dragging Dad's memory through the mud and proving to everyone that he was right not to trust you with this. Ryan's face went pale, then flushed again even darker. Get out, he said through clenched teeth. Get out of my office. I left, my hands trembling so badly I could barely open the door. His assistant looked up as I passed, her expression carefully neutral, but I could tell she'd heard at least some of the shouting. By tomorrow, everyone in Copper Ridge would know that the Walker siblings were at war. Small towns had their own communication networks more efficient than any social media. I made it to my car before the tears came, hot and angry and mixed with a grief I hadn't fully processed yet. My father had been gone less than 2 months, and already his final wishes were being used as ammunition in a battle he tried so hard to prevent. He'd known this might happen. That was why he'd structured everything so carefully, why he'd left me the video message, why he'd warned me about how people react when they feel cheated by circumstances they don't understand. But knowing he'd anticipated this didn't make it hurt less. Ryan was my brother. For all our differences, for all the ways our mother had favored him over the years, I'd loved him. I cheered for his successes and defended him when people called him arrogant or calculating. I'd believed that underneath the polish and ambition was someone who cared about family, about doing right by the people who mattered. Now I wondered if I'd ever really known him at all, or if I'd just been in love with the idea of having a brother who saw me as an equal instead of a lesser version of what a Walker child should be. My phone rang as I sat in the parking lot still crying. It was our mother. Emma, she said without preamble, her voice tight with controlled anger. Ryan just called me. He told me about the mineral deposits. Is it true? Did your father really leave you something that valuable? The accusation in her tone was like a slap. Not concern for how I was handling the situation. Not curiosity about what Dad had discovered. Just immediate suspicion that I'd somehow cheated, somehow manipulated circumstances to get more than my fair share. Yes, I said flatly. It's true. Dad spent years documenting lithium and rare earth deposits on the property. He left me everything he'd learned and the mineral rights to develop or sell as I see fit. It's all legal, all documented, all exactly what he intended. There was a long silence. Then Patricia Walker said, in the coldest voice I'd ever heard from her, "This is unacceptable. Your father would never have deliberately created such an imbalance between you and Ryan. He must have been confused about the value, or perhaps someone took advantage of his condition to influence his decisions. We need to discuss this as a family, Emma. We need to make this right." Make it right, I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping. You mean make it equal? Give Ryan half of what Dad specifically left to me because you can't stand the idea that for once I got something he didn't. Don't you dare take that tone with me, my mother snapped. I am trying to preserve this family. Your father would be horrified to see you and Ryan fighting like this. The least you could do is show some consideration for your brother's feelings. He's been very hurt by all of this. And I haven't? The words burst out of me. All the years of being second best and overlooked and dismissed finally finding their voice. Do you have any idea what it felt like to sit in that attorney's office and listen to Ryan laugh at what Dad left me? To have you pat my hand like I was a child who needed comfort because I got the booby prize? To know that both of you just automatically assumed I was worth less than he was? Emma, that's not fair. Isn't it? When have you ever believed I was capable of anything significant, Mom? When have you ever looked at my choices and thought they were just as valid as Ryan's, just different? Never. Because in your eyes, I've always been the disappointment. The one who didn't want what you wanted, didn't value what you valued, didn't become the kind of daughter you could brag about at your book club meetings. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. If you're going to be hysterical, she said icily, then there's no point in continuing this conversation. But you should know that Ryan is exploring his legal options. If you cared at all about your father's legacy, you'd work with him to find a fair solution instead of hiding behind technicalities. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone at the ended call, at the evidence that my entire family had chosen sides in a war I hadn't wanted to fight. They didn't care about fairness or my father's wishes or the careful thought he'd put into his decisions. They cared about maintaining their comfortable assumptions about who deserved what, and I'd had the audacity to disrupt their worldview by turning out to be worth more than they'd calculated. The next week was brutal. Ryan hired an attorney, someone from a big firm in Helena with a reputation for aggressive litigation. They filed a motion to contest the will based on claims of undue influence and diminished mental capacity. The local paper got wind of the story and ran an article about the Walker family dispute, complete with speculation about the value of the mineral deposits and interviews with townspeople who remembered Robert Walker spending his weekends at Ravens Peak. Public opinion split predictably. Half the town thought I was being selfish, that a good daughter would share such a windfall with her brother. The other half thought Ryan was being greedy, that he should respect his father's wishes instead of trying to overturn them. People I barely knew felt entitled to have opinions about what I should do with my inheritance, as if my father's final gifts were somehow community property subject to popular vote. I stopped going to the Copper Cup for coffee after the third time someone approached my table to share their unsolicited thoughts on the situation. I started taking back roads to avoid driving past people who might recognize my car. I let my phone go to voicemail because I couldn't stand another call from a distant relative or family friend who wanted to mediate or advise, or just hear the gossip firsthand. The only person I talked to regularly was Dr. Foster, who had become something of an unlikely ally. She'd known my father for years, had worked with him on the initial surveys, and she was furious at the suggestion that he'd been incompetent or confused. She offered to testify on my behalf, to provide documentation of their work together, to make it clear that Robert Walker had been methodical and deliberate right up until his death. Your father was sharper at 70 than most people are at 40, she told me over coffee at her house in Bozeman, far enough from Copper Ridge that I didn't have to worry about being recognized. He understood exactly what he was doing with that will, Emma. He told me once that he was giving Ryan money because Ryan understood money, and he was giving you the land because you understood legacy. He believed you'd do something meaningful with it, something that honored the earth and the resources instead of just extracting maximum profit. But what if I don't know how to do that? I asked, voicing the fear that kept me awake at night. What if I make the wrong choice and it turns out Dad's faith in me was misplaced? Dr. Foster reached across the table and gripped my hand, her fingers strong and weathered from decades of fieldwork. Then you'll make the wrong choice and learn from it, just like every other human who's ever tried to do something difficult. Your father didn't expect you to be perfect, Emma. He expected you to try, to care, to think about more than just your own immediate benefit. That's already more than most people do. The legal battle ground on through December and into January. Depositions and document reviews and endless meetings with James Thornton, who remained unflappable in the face of Ryan's attorney's aggressive tactics. They tried to paint me as a manipulative daughter who'd isolated my father in his final years, but the evidence didn't support their narrative. My father's medical records showed no cognitive decline. His financial records showed that I'd never asked him for money or tried to influence his decisions. The timeline of the mineral surveys and rights claims showed that he'd been working on this project for years before his death, methodically building a case for the land's value. What Ryan's attorneys couldn't explain away was the video message. When James Thornton presented it in a closed hearing, showing my father's clear, coherent explanation of his reasoning, their case began to crumble. You could contest a lot of things, but you couldn't contest a man's own words, recorded when he was demonstrably healthy and lucid, explaining exactly why he'd structured his will the way he had. The judge scheduled a formal hearing for mid-February, but before that date arrived, something shifted. I was at the property one cold January morning, checking on the survey shack after a heavy snowfall, when I found fresh footprints that weren't mine. They led from the access road to the shack, circled it completely, then headed back out. Someone had been there recently, and given the snow conditions, it had to have been within the last few hours. My skin prickled with unease. I checked the door and found scratches around the lock, evidence of someone trying to force entry. They hadn't succeeded, the old deadbolt had held, but the intent was clear. Someone wanted access to what was inside badly enough to attempt a break-in in broad daylight. I called the county sheriff, who sent a deputy out to take a report. He photographed the footprints and the scratches, dusted for fingerprints that probably wouldn't yield anything useful, and promised to increase patrols in the area. But we both knew that 40 acres of rural Montana was impossible to properly secure. If someone wanted to get into that shack badly enough, they'd find a way. That night, I moved the few remaining items of value out of the shack and into my apartment. My father's compass, which I'd been keeping there for sentimental reasons. Some of the original hand-drawn maps that had particular emotional significance. The coffee mug he'd used, still stained with decades-old residue. I packed them carefully, feeling like I was dismantling the last physical space where my father's presence still felt tangible. As I locked the shack for what I suspected might be the last time, at least for a while, I stood in the darkness and looked up at the stars. They were impossibly bright away from town, scattered across the sky in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia. My father had taught me some of the constellations, had explained how ancient people used them for navigation before compasses and GPS made such knowledge obsolete. Trust the compass, he'd written in his letter. I'd thought he meant the physical object, the brass instrument that pointed north with mechanical certainty. But standing there under the vast Montana sky, I realized he'd meant something deeper. Trust your internal compass. Trust your sense of right and wrong. Trust that you know the difference between what's profitable and what's meaningful. Ryan would have seen those mineral deposits and immediately calculated their dollar value. He would have contacted mining companies, negotiated the best deal, and moved forward without second thoughts because that was what you did with valuable resources. You extracted them. You monetized them. You converted potential into profit as efficiently as possible. But I kept thinking about the land itself, about what extraction would mean. The open pit mines I'd seen in photos while researching, vast scars in the earth that would take centuries to heal if they ever did. The water usage, the waste products, the disruption to whatever fragile ecosystem had established itself in this harsh landscape. The rare earth processing, which often involved toxic chemicals and created radioactive byproducts that had to be stored indefinitely. I believed in the importance of these materials for the energy transition. The world needed lithium for batteries, needed rare earth elements for renewable technology. But did it need them from this particular piece of land? Were there ways to extract them that minimized harm? And if I profited from that extraction, what responsibility did I have to use that wealth for something that balanced the scales? These were the questions my father had believed I would ask. These were the considerations he'd trusted me to weigh. And the fact that Ryan hadn't even thought to ask them, that he'd immediately jumped to accusations and legal threats without pausing to consider why our father might have made different choices for different children, told me everything I needed to know about whether Dad's assessment had been correct. The attempted break-in changed something in the trajectory of the legal battle. Ryan's attorneys had to answer questions about whether their client or his associates might have been involved. They vehemently denied it, and I actually believed them. Ryan was many things, but I didn't think he was stupid enough to risk criminal charges over what was essentially a civil dispute he was likely to lose anyway. But the incident made the judge question Ryan's judgment in other ways. If the situation had become heated enough that someone felt entitled to break into property that was part of an active legal dispute, then perhaps the dispute itself was spiraling in unhealthy directions. The judge strongly encouraged both parties to consider mediation, to find a resolution that didn't require dragging our family through a full trial. James Thornton presented the idea to me over dinner at his house, his wife having made pot roast that reminded me painfully of family dinners before everything fell apart. The judge wants you to consider offering Ryan a settlement, he explained. Not because your legal position is weak, it's extremely strong, but because family disputes have a way of creating wounds that outlast any court decision. You could offer him a cash settlement, something substantial enough to feel fair but small enough that you retain the bulk of the asset value. It would end this quickly and let both of you move on. I pushed food around my plate, appetite gone. How much would be substantial enough? Thornton considered. Based on his attorney's demands, they're looking for something in the range of 20 to 30 million. They're arguing that your father would have wanted the inheritance to be equal in value if not in form, so you should effectively split the difference. $20 to $30 million. To give to my brother, who hadn't spent years working with our father to document what was there. Who hadn't taken time to understand the responsibility that came with this knowledge. Who wanted the money simply because he felt entitled to it, because his sense of self-worth was threatened by the idea that I'd received something more valuable than he had. No, I said quietly but firmly. I won't give him anything. Not because I want to be vindictive or because I don't love him, but because Dad specifically chose not to do this. He had 17 years to structure things differently if he'd wanted the inheritance to be equal in value. He chose this distribution deliberately, and paying Ryan off just to make peace would invalidate every careful decision Dad made. Thornton nodded slowly, no surprise in his expression. I thought you'd say that. And for what it's worth, I agree with you. Your father was very clear with me about his reasoning. He didn't want Ryan to have access to this particular asset because he believed Ryan would make choices your father couldn't live with, even from beyond the grave. Giving Ryan money now would just be doing indirectly what your father refused to do directly. So we go to trial? I asked, the weight of it settling over me like snow. We go to trial, Thornton confirmed. But Emma, I want you to be prepared for what that means. Your relationship with your brother will likely never recover. Your mother will probably side with him, which means losing that relationship too. The town will be divided. People will judge you, will call you selfish and greedy, no matter how solid your legal and moral position is. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my father's video message, his calm voice explaining why he trusted me with this. I thought about the compass in my apartment, its needle always finding north no matter how you turned it. I thought about the questions I'd asked myself about responsibility and legacy, and what it meant to honor someone's faith in you. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. Because the alternative is pretending Dad didn't know what he was doing, and I won't dishonor him that way. Not for Ryan. Not for Mom. Not for anyone. The trial date was set for March 15th. In the weeks leading up to it, I threw myself into research, trying to understand not just the legal issues but the deeper questions about what I would actually do with the mineral rights once they were unambiguously mine. I contacted environmental groups, mining companies with sustainable practices, economists who studied resource extraction and community impact. I read everything I could find about reclamation requirements and water rights, and the long-term effects of rare earth processing. What emerged was a picture far more complex than I'd initially understood. There were mining companies that did genuinely try to minimize environmental damage, that worked with communities to ensure local benefit, that invested in reclamation and monitoring. There were also companies that made big promises and delivered minimal results, that extracted maximum value and left behind maximum destruction, that exploited gaps in regulation and enforcement. Choosing the right partner if I decided to move forward with extraction would be crucial. And that choice couldn't be made based solely on who offered the highest royalty rate or the biggest upfront payment. It had to be made based on values, on long-term thinking, on the kind of careful analysis my father had applied to everything he did. I began drafting what I thought of as my own ethical framework, a set of principles that would guide whatever decisions I made. Community benefit agreements that guarantee jobs and infrastructure improvements for Copper Ridge. Water protection clauses that went beyond minimum legal requirements. Reclamation plans that were funded upfront, not promised for some distant future. Third-party environmental monitoring with transparent reporting. A commitment to research cleaner extraction methods even if they cost more initially. Dr. Foster reviewed my drafts and made suggestions, connected me with people who'd negotiated similar agreements elsewhere, helped me understand what was realistic to demand and what would just scare away potential partners entirely. You're thinking about this the right way, she told me. Your father would be incredibly proud of the care you're putting into this. But would he? I wondered sometimes, alone in my apartment with spreadsheets and environmental impact reports scattered across every surface. Or would he think I was overthinking, paralyzing myself with considerations that would ultimately prevent me from doing anything at all? There was a difference between being thoughtful and being afraid to act. I needed to make sure I was operating from wisdom rather than fear. The other person I found myself talking to regularly was Kevin Price, Ryan's business partner. He called me in early March, his voice carefully neutral, and asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost refused, certain it was some kind of setup, but curiosity won out. We met at a coffee shop in Livingston, neutral territory where neither of us was likely to be recognized. Kevin was in his early 40s, successful in the way that came from natural charisma more than genuine competence. He'd partnered with Ryan 5 years earlier, and together they'd built Walker Development into one of the more prominent firms in the region. He ordered an elaborate espresso drink and got straight to the point. "Ryan's been my friend for a decade," he said, "but I'm watching him destroy himself over this, and I can't just stand by anymore. He's not sleeping. He's not eating. He's obsessed with this case to the point that he's ignoring actual business that needs his attention. And the worst part is I think deep down he knows he's wrong. Then why doesn't he drop the lawsuit?" I asked, stirring sugar into coffee I didn't really want. Kevin sighed, running a hand through his expensive haircut. "Because that would mean admitting that your father loved you as much as him, just differently. Ryan's built his entire identity on being the golden child, the one your parents were proudest of. This will, Emma, it fundamentally challenges that narrative. If your dad deliberately gave you the more valuable inheritance, then what does that say about everything Ryan believed about his place in the family?" I looked at Kevin across the table, this man who'd been my brother's closest friend and business partner for years, and saw genuine concern in his eyes. "It says that Dad loved us both," I answered quietly, "but in different ways. Ryan got financial support to build the life he wanted. I got something that required me to think about what kind of life I should want. Neither one is better or worse. They're just different." Kevin nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his face. "That's exactly what I tried to tell him. But he can't hear it, Emma. All he can hear is that he wasn't enough, that after building his whole life trying to make your parents proud, your dad's final act was essentially saying that you were more deserving of the real treasure. It's destroying him in ways I don't think even he fully understands." We sat in silence for a moment, the coffee shop bustling around us with people living ordinary lives unencumbered by inheritance disputes and family fractures. I thought about all the years Ryan and I had been siblings, all the moments both good and painful that had built the relationship now crumbling under the weight of money and misunderstanding. "What do you want me to do, Kevin?" I asked finally. "You didn't ask me here just to explain Ryan's psychology. What are you hoping I'll say?" He leaned forward, his expression intense. "I'm hoping you'll agree to talk to him. Really talk to him, not through lawyers or informal depositions, just the two of you having an honest conversation about what your father actually intended. Because I think if Ryan could hear from you, without all the legal posturing and accusations, he might be able to let this go. He might be able to accept that this isn't a referendum on his worth as a person or a son." "Ryan made it clear he doesn't want to hear anything from me," I said, remembering the coldness in his voice when he told me to get out of his office. "He thinks I'm a liar and a manipulator who somehow convinced Dad to disinherit him." "He was angry and hurt and lashing out," Kevin countered. "But I've known Ryan a long time, Emma. Underneath all that defensive anger is someone who's terrified that maybe his whole understanding of his family was wrong. Give him a chance to work through that fear with you instead of against you." I wanted to say no. I wanted to protect myself from more rejection and accusations, to hide behind the legal fortress James Thornton had built around my rights and my father's clearly stated intentions. But something in Kevin's earnest expression made me pause. What if he was right? What if there was still a chance to salvage something of the relationship Ryan and I had once had? "One conversation," I said slowly. "I'll agree to one meeting, just Ryan and me, no lawyers or witnesses. But if he uses it as an opportunity to berate or threaten me, I'm done. I won't put myself through that again." Kevin's face broke into a smile of genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Emma. Seriously, I think this could make all the difference. Let me talk to him, see if I can get him in the right headspace for this. I'll call you with a time and place." 3 days later, I found myself walking into a small diner on the outskirts of Billings. The kind of place where truckers stopped for breakfast, and nobody paid attention to other people's conversations. Ryan was already there, sitting in a corner booth, looking thinner and more drawn than I remembered. The expensive watch was still on his wrist, the designer clothes still impeccable, but something fundamental had shifted in the way he carried himself. The confident swagger had been replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched uncomfortably until I finally slid into the booth across from him. "Thanks for coming," he said. his voice rough as if he hadn't used it much lately. Kevin said you wanted to talk, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I'm listening. Ryan fiddled with his coffee cup, not meeting my eyes. I've been an asshole, he said abruptly. About all of this. The way I laughed in the lawyer's office, the things I said, the lawsuit. I've been acting like you somehow stole something that was rightfully mine, when the truth is Dad left us exactly what he left us. I just didn't want to accept what that meant. The admission hung between us, raw and unexpected. I hadn't prepared myself for Ryan to actually acknowledge fault. I'd braced for more accusations, more justifications, more attempts to make me the villain in a story where he could remain the wronged hero. What does it mean to you? I asked softly. What Dad did with his will. Ryan finally looked at me, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion or unshed tears or both. It means he thought you were better than me, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. It means that after spending my whole life trying to be the son he could be proud of, trying to build something impressive, trying to succeed in ways that mattered, he still chose you for the real inheritance. The one that actually meant something. Ryan, I said, leaning forward, that's not what it means at all. Dad gave you money because he knew you'd use it well, that you'd build exactly the life you wanted. He gave me the land because he knew I'd struggle with it, that I'd agonize over every decision, that I'd probably spend years trying to figure out the right thing to do. He gave you certainty. He gave me a test. That's just another way of saying he trusted you more, Ryan countered. But some of the heat had gone out of his voice. He left you something that required character and integrity and thoughtfulness. He left me money like I was some kid who needed an allowance. He left you the foundation to build your own empire, I said firmly. He didn't limit how you could use it or impose conditions or suggest you weren't capable of making good choices with it. That's respect, Ryan. That's him saying he trusted you to know what you needed, and to go get it without interference. What he left me comes with enormous responsibility and pressure, and the constant question of whether I'm making choices he'd approve of. Neither inheritance is better or worse. They're just suited to different people. Ryan was quiet for a long moment processing this. Then why didn't he talk to me about it? He asked, and now the pain in his voice was unmistakable. Why did he spend all those years documenting the mineral deposits and never once mention it to me? If he really trusted me, if he really believed I was capable, why shut me out of something that's significant? This was the heart of it, I realized. Not the money, not even the perceived favoritism, but the exclusion. Ryan had built his professional life around being included, being consulted, being in the room where decisions happened. Our father's secret project had made him feel like a child excluded from adult conversations. I think he knew you'd want to monetize it immediately, I said carefully. That you'd see the dollar value and move forward with extraction because that's what you do, that's your skill set. And I think he wanted to preserve the choice for longer, to document everything thoroughly, to wait until the time was right to make decisions about development. He couldn't have done that if you'd known, Ryan. You would have pushed for action because that's who you are. You see opportunity and you seize it. He needed someone who would see opportunity and sit with it. So I'm too impulsive? Ryan said, but there was less defensiveness in his tone now, more genuine curiosity about how others perceived him. Too quick to jump? Not to anything, I replied. Just different from what this particular situation required. Dad had different skills, and he needed someone whose instincts matched his own for this specific thing. It doesn't mean your instincts are wrong, Ryan. Just means they weren't right for this. The waitress refilled our coffee, and we sat in silence until she moved away. Ryan traced patterns in the condensation on his water glass, his expression distant. I've spent the last 2 months absolutely convinced that you manipulated Dad somehow, he said finally. That you must have poisoned him against me or convinced him I was a terrible person or something. Because the alternative, that he simply made a thoughtful choice based on our different strengths, was too painful to accept. It meant I wasn't the favorite. And I've been the favorite my whole life, Em. It's the only role I know how to play. Maybe it's time to learn a different role, I suggested gently. Being the favorite comes with its own kind of prison. You're never allowed to struggle or doubt or fail because that would disrupt everyone's assumptions. At least being the disappointment gave me freedom to make mistakes. Ryan laughed, a real laugh this time, startled and genuine. Is that what you think you were? The disappointment? That's what I know I was, I corrected. Mom made it pretty clear my choices weren't what she hoped for. You were the success story. I was the question mark. Emma, Ryan said, leaning forward with sudden intensity, you were never the disappointment. You were the mystery. Mom and I were easy to understand. We want conventional success, status, recognition. But you've always wanted something else, something we couldn't quite figure out. Scared Mom, I think. She didn't know how to guide you because she didn't understand where you were trying to go. I felt tears prick my eyes unexpectedly. This was the most honest conversation Ryan and I had ever had, stripping away decades of family dynamics and unspoken assumptions to get at something true underneath. I'm sorry for how I reacted, Ryan said, and this time he met my eyes directly. I'm sorry for the lawsuit and the accusations and the absolute shitshow I've created over the past 2 months. You didn't deserve that. Dad made his choice, and it was based on knowing us better than we probably know ourselves. I need to accept that and stop trying to rewrite it into something that protects my ego. What about the lawsuit? I asked, almost afraid to hope. Are you dropping it? Ryan nodded slowly. I'll call my lawyers this afternoon. We'll file to dismiss with prejudice, which means I can't refile later. It's done, Emma. The land is yours, the mineral rights are yours, all of it. I won't contest it anymore. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I felt momentarily dizzy. Thank you, I whispered. You have no idea what it's been like fighting you while grieving Dad. It's been one of the worst experiences of my life. I can imagine, Ryan said quietly. And I'm sorry I put you through it. I was so focused on what I thought I'd lost that I never considered what this was costing you. We finished our coffee in a silence that felt different from all the silences that had come before. Less hostile and more contemplative. As we stood to leave, Ryan hesitated, then pulled me into a hug. It was awkward and brief, both of us out of practice with physical affection, but it meant something. It meant that maybe, eventually, we could find our way back to being siblings instead of adversaries. I'm proud of you, he said as we separated. Whatever you decide to do with that land, I trust that. You'll make a choice Dad would respect. And for what it's worth, I think you're going to do something really impressive with it. Something that matters more than just the money. I watched him walk to his Range Rover, shoulders straighter than when he'd arrived, and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since the day of the will reading. We weren't fixed. Years of family dysfunction didn't evaporate because of one honest conversation. But we'd found a starting point. A foundation on which something new might eventually be built. The trial date came and went, dismissed before it could begin. James Thornton called with the news, his voice warm with approval. Your brother's attorneys filed this morning, he said. It's over, Emma. The mineral rights are unambiguously yours. No further challenges possible. You're free to move forward with whatever plans you want to make. I sat in my apartment with the paperwork spread before me. Official documents declaring me the sole owner of mineral rights that could transform my life entirely. Outside, March snow was falling, late-season flurries that would be gone by afternoon. I thought about my father, about all the hours he'd spent at Ravens Peak documenting deposits and dreaming about what they might mean. I thought about the compass on my dresser, its needle always finding true north regardless of where you stood. Dr. Foster had arranged meetings with 3 mining companies, all of which had strong environmental records and genuine interest in sustainable extraction practices. Each meeting would be an opportunity to discuss not just royalty rates and extraction timelines, but values and priorities and long-term vision. I had time now to make these choices carefully, without the pressure of legal battles or family conflict. But first I needed to visit the land. I needed to stand on the 40 acres my father had loved and figure out what I actually wanted to do with the responsibility he'd entrusted to me. I drove out to Ravens Peak on a clear Saturday morning, the road familiar now from dozens of trips over the winter. The survey shack looked the same as always, weathered and humble, giving no indication of the significance it held. I walked the property slowly, following paths my father had worn over years of surveying. The ground was still partly frozen, resistant to my footsteps, but here and there signs of spring were beginning to emerge. Tough little plants pushing through rocky soil, stubborn and determined. Life finding a way even in harsh conditions. At the highest point of the property, where you could see for miles across the valley, I stopped and looked out at the landscape. It wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. This wasn't scenic mountain country that belonged on postcards. It was austere and challenging, the kind of place that demanded respect rather than inspiring easy admiration. But it was mine, and beneath it lay materials that could power the world's transition to renewable energy. that could reduce dependence on foreign mineral sources, that could contribute to technologies not yet imagined. The potential was staggering. The responsibility was equally so. I thought about Ryan, about how quickly he would have moved to monetize this opportunity. He wasn't wrong to value efficiency and profit. The world ran on those principles, and people who could execute quickly and effectively were valuable. But my father had understood that some decisions required a different approach, that the most important choices were often the ones you sat with longest before acting. Over the next month, I met with all 3 mining companies. I listened to their proposals, studied their track records, visited sites they developed elsewhere. I consulted with environmental groups and community organizers and economists who specialized in resource extraction impacts. I drafted and redrafted my own requirements, the non-negotiable principles that would govern any agreement I made. The company I finally chose wasn't the one offering the highest royalty rate. They were a mid-sized firm out of Colorado with a 20-year history of partnering with landowners and communities, rather than simply extracting and abandoning. Their proposal included provisions I'd insisted on: community hiring quotas, water protection standards that exceeded state requirements, third-party environmental monitoring, progressive reclamation that would begin during extraction rather than after, and a substantial percentage of profits dedicated to renewable energy research. The royalty structure was complex, designed to provide steady income over decades, rather than a massive upfront payment. Conservative estimates suggested I'd receive between $40 and $60 million over the life of the mine, paid out in quarterly installments that would give me time to think carefully about how to use the wealth rather than being overwhelmed by sudden fortune. But more important than the money were the provisions I'd negotiated around control and oversight. I would have approval rights over extraction methods, could halt operations if environmental standards weren't being met, and would receive detailed quarterly reports on everything from water quality to reclamation progress. I wasn't just selling mineral rights and walking away. I was entering a partnership that would require active engagement and careful monitoring for years to come. When I signed the final contract in early June, James Thornton present as my attorney and Dr. Foster present as my geological advisor, I felt my father's presence so strongly it was almost physical. This was what he'd trusted me to do. Not maximize profit but maximize responsibility. Not rush to convert potential into cash, but take the time to ensure that extraction happened in ways that honored the land and served purposes beyond my own enrichment. The first royalty payment arrived in August, a check so large I stared at it for several minutes before depositing it, unable to quite believe the numbers were real. $68,000 for a single quarter. Multiplied over years, the financial security it represented was almost incomprehensible to someone who'd spent her entire adult life on a researcher's salary. But rather than immediately improving my own circumstances, I made other choices first. I established the Robert Walker Environmental Fund, dedicating 30% of all royalty income to supporting sustainable mining research and environmental restoration projects in Montana. I created scholarship programs for students from Copper Ridge pursuing degrees in environmental science or geology. I invested in renewable energy infrastructure for the town, helping to fund a solar array that would reduce the community's dependence on fossil fuels. Only after those commitments were secured did I address my own situation. I paid off my student loans in a single payment, a moment of satisfaction so profound I actually cried. Bought a modest house near Ravens Peak, nothing ostentatious but solid and mine. I set up retirement accounts and invested conservatively, building long-term security, rather than chasing short-term luxury. Ryan and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully, like people learning a language they'd once known but had nearly forgotten. We met for dinner occasionally, conversations gradually becoming easier as we both adjusted to new understandings of ourselves and each other. He was genuinely impressed by what I'd negotiated with the mining company, admitted he would never have thought to include half the provisions I'd insisted on. "You built something that's going to last," he told me over drinks one evening. "Not just the financial returns but the actual structure of the agreement. That's going to be a model for other landowners dealing with mineral rights. You've created something meaningful, Em." Coming from Ryan, from someone who'd spent his career building things, the compliment meant more than he probably realized. We would never have the uncomplicated sibling relationship some families enjoyed. Too much had happened, too many wounds had been opened that would leave permanent scars. But we'd found a way to exist in each other's lives without active hostility, and that felt like enough. My mother took longer to come around. Patricia Walker had a harder time accepting that her assumptions about her children had been fundamentally challenged. But gradually, as she saw what I was building with the inheritance, as people in town spoke admiringly about the scholarships and the environmental fund, she softened. We would never be close in the way mothers and daughters in television shows seem to be. But we achieved something like mutual respect, an acknowledgement that different didn't mean wrong. The mining operation began in earnest the following spring, carefully managed and closely monitored. I visited the site regularly, walking the perimeter with company representatives, reviewing environmental reports, ensuring that every provision of our agreement was being honored. It was work that required attention and engagement, that demanded I continue educating myself about extraction processes and environmental impacts and regulatory frameworks. But it was meaningful work. It was the kind of responsibility my father had believed I could handle, had trusted me to approach with care and integrity. And every quarterly payment, every scholarship awarded, every environmental project funded, felt like a continuation of the conversation he'd started with that inheritance. On what would have been my father's 72nd birthday, I drove out to Hillside Cemetery as the sun was setting. The grave marker I'd chosen was simple but elegant, carved from Montana stone, with his name and dates and a single line underneath that I'd taken from one of his journal entries. He read the earth with patience and respect. I placed fresh flowers in the holder and sat on the grass beside the marker, looking out over the valley where Raven's Peak rose in the distance. The bioluminescent coating I'd had applied to the stone glowed faintly in the dimming light, a subtle memorial to his years of careful observation and documentation. "You were right, Dad," I said quietly, not caring if anyone saw me talking to a gravestone. About Ryan, about me, about what we each needed. I didn't understand it at first. I felt so hurt and confused and angry. But you knew that giving me this gift meant giving me time to become the person who could handle it responsibly. Thank you for having faith in me when I didn't have it in myself. The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. A raven called from somewhere overhead, its harsh voice somehow appropriate for this place and this moment. I thought about foundations, about the literal geological foundations beneath Raven's Peak, and the metaphorical foundations my father had helped me build. About how the strongest structures took time and care and patience to create, couldn't be rushed or shortcut without compromising their integrity. Ryan had gotten money to build his house, and he'd done exactly that, a beautiful home that reflected his success and ambition. I'd gotten land that required me to become someone worthy of what it contained. Neither inheritance was better or worse. They were simply suited to different people, different needs, different paths toward becoming fully ourselves. As darkness settled completely, the stone's glow strengthened, visible proof of the care my father had invested in understanding the natural world. I stood slowly, my hand resting briefly on the marker, feeling the warmth it had absorbed from the day's sun now radiating back into the cool evening air. The compass he'd left me sat on my mantel at home, pointing true north with mechanical certainty. But I understood now that the real compass he'd given me was internal, a sense of direction that didn't come from magnetic fields but from values and priorities and the patient work of figuring out what actually mattered. Some people navigated by profit, some by status, some by others' approval. I'd learned to navigate by something harder to quantify but more reliable in the long term. Integrity, responsibility, the quiet satisfaction of making choices I could live with not just today but years into the future. My father had bet 40 acres and a fortune in minerals that I'd figure that out, that I'd understand foundations mattered more than facades, that depth trumped surface, that the best inheritances weren't the ones that looked valuable, but the ones that made you become someone capable of handling value. I walked back to my car as stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had guided travelers for millennia before compasses made such navigation obsolete. But compasses could break, could be lost, could point to magnetic north while true north lay somewhere slightly different. The stars remained constant and reliable, if you took the time to learn their language. My father had spent his life reading the earth, understanding what lay beneath surfaces, documenting truths that weren't immediately obvious. He'd taught me to do the same, and in doing so, had given me something worth more than any mineral deposit. He'd given me the tools to build a life of meaning rather than just success, of substance rather than just appearance. The drive home took me past Ryan's development, the luxury homes glowing with warm light, families visible through large windows living their carefully constructed lives. There was beauty there, achievement worth acknowledging. But there was also beauty in what I'd built, in the careful partnership with the mining company, in the environmental fund that would operate long after I was gone, in the students who'd attend college because of scholarships bearing our father's name. Different kinds of beauty, different kinds of success. Both valid, both valuable, just suited to different people with different priorities. My father had understood that, had structured his final gifts to honor those differences rather than pretend we were interchangeable. As I pulled into my driveway, my modest house welcoming in its simplicity, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before his death. Peace. Not the absence of challenge or difficulty, but the deep satisfaction of knowing I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, becoming exactly who my father had believed I could be. The land at Raven's Peak would produce wealth for decades, but the real inheritance, the one that actually transformed my life, was the faith my father had placed in me to handle that wealth responsibly. He'd given Ryan money because money was what Ryan understood. He'd given me trust because trust was what I'd needed to finally see myself as someone capable of significant things. Some people got houses, some got land, some got money, some got responsibility. And if you were very lucky, if you paid attention and thought carefully and honored the person who'd chosen to believe in you, you got the chance to prove that their faith wasn't misplaced. I'd spent months thinking I'd inherited dirt and rocks while my brother got the real prize. Now I understood I'd received exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it, from someone who'd loved me enough to give me not what I wanted but what would make me grow. That was the inheritance that mattered. Everything else was just money. 5 years had passed since the day I'd signed the mining agreement, and Ravens Peak Valley looked different now in ways both obvious and subtle. The extraction site itself was carefully contained, a section of the 40 acres marked by industrial equipment and the organized chaos of responsible mining operations. But surrounding it, the land remained largely untouched, and in some places had actually improved under the reclamation work that happened concurrently with extraction, exactly as the contract specified. I stood at the edge of the active site on a crisp October morning, watching the crew work with the kind of precision that came from proper training and genuine commitment to environmental standards. The site supervisor, a woman named Teresa Brennan who'd relocated from Colorado specifically for this project, approached with her usual morning report tablet in hand. "Water quality readings are excellent this quarter," she said, pulling up charts that meant something to me now after years of learning the technical language of mining operations. "We're actually seeing improvement in some downstream metrics compared to baseline measurements from before we started. The filtration systems are working better than projected." I nodded, studying the data with eyes that had become educated through necessity and genuine interest. My father would have appreciated this, I thought. The methodical documentation, the careful monitoring, the refusal to accept surface-level assurances when deeper verification was possible. I'd learned those habits from him, applied them to an industry he'd never worked in but would have understood instinctively. The scholarship program had sent its first cohort of students to college 3 years ago. This fall, 2 of them were returning to Copper Ridge with degrees in environmental engineering and geology, planning to work either for the mining company or for the oversight foundation I'd established. The cycle my father had started was perpetuating itself, creating more people who understood that extraction and environmental responsibility weren't mutually exclusive if you cared enough to do the work properly. Ryan had called the previous week, his voice carrying news he seemed genuinely excited to share. His development company had just landed a major contract to build affordable housing outside Bozeman, a project that emphasized sustainable materials and energy-efficient design. It was a departure from the luxury homes that had built his reputation, something that suggested he'd been doing his own growth and reconsideration over the years. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me during that call, "about how Dad gave us different things because we needed different lessons. I think I'm finally starting to understand what my lesson was supposed to be. That success isn't just about maximizing profit or building the most impressive thing. Sometimes it's about building what's actually needed, even if it's less flashy." We'd planned dinner for the following month, a regular occurrence now that the hostility and hurt had faded into something more like mutual respect and cautious affection. Our relationship would never be uncomplicated, but it had become real in ways it never was when we were playing assigned family roles. He was no longer the golden child, and I was no longer the disappointment. We were simply two people related by blood and history, trying to build something honest with the inheritance we'd each received. My mother had surprised me most of all. Patricia Walker had spent 3 years being distantly polite about my choices before something shifted. She'd attended the dedication ceremony for the Environmental Center funded by the Robert Walker Foundation, had listened to speakers discuss the impact of the scholarships and research grants, had seen her late husband's name attached to work that would outlast any of us. Afterward, she'd pulled me aside, her eyes bright with tears she was trying to contain. "I was wrong about you," she'd said simply. "I spent your whole life thinking you didn't have ambition because you didn't want what I wanted. But you had something better than ambition. You had purpose. Your father saw that. I wish I had." It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Years of feeling like the lesser child didn't evaporate because of one emotional conversation. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that maybe the story she told herself about her children had been incomplete. We had lunch once a month now. Conversations that were sometimes still awkward, but increasingly felt like two adults learning to appreciate each other, rather than a mother disappointed in a daughter who'd failed to meet unspoken expectations. The mining operation was projected to continue for another 15 years, maybe longer if new deposits were discovered during extraction. The quarterly payments had become so routine I'd almost stopped being amazed by them, though I never took them for granted. The wealth they represented had transformed my life in ways both practical and philosophical, but it hadn't corrupted the core principles my father had trusted me to maintain. I'd become something of an accidental expert on responsible mineral extraction, had been invited to speak at conferences and consult on other projects where landowners were negotiating with mining companies. People wanted to know how I'd structured the agreement, what provisions I'd insisted on, how I'd maintained oversight without becoming adversarial. The answer was always the same. I'd approached it the way my father taught me to approach everything. Slowly, carefully, with patience and a commitment to understanding depth, rather than being satisfied with surface. Dr. Foster had retired the previous year, but not before helping me establish a research partnership with Montana Tech that would continue the geological work my father had started. Graduate students now did their fieldwork at Ravens Peak, studying not just the mineral deposits, but the broader geological history of the region. The survey shack had been renovated and expanded into a small research station, housing equipment and serving as base camp for the ongoing documentation of what the land had to teach. On this particular October morning, standing at the edge of the extraction site with Teresa's report still pulled up on the tablet, I thought about foundations again. The literal foundation of rock and mineral beneath my feet. The metaphorical foundation my father had helped me build through years of patient teaching, I hadn't fully appreciated until after his death. The institutional foundation I was now building through scholarships and research programs and community partnerships, structures that would outlast my own lifetime. Ryan had gotten money to build a house, and houses served their purpose well but eventually crumbled or were torn down for something newer. I'd gotten land that taught me to build things meant to last, to think in terms of decades and generations rather than quarterly returns and immediate gratification. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply suited to different purposes, different values, different definitions of success. My phone buzzed with a message from James Thornton. He was fully retired now. His law practice passed to a younger partner, but he still checked in occasionally to see how things were progressing. The message was brief. "Your father would be extraordinarily proud. I hope you know that." I typed back. "I'm starting to. Thank you for everything." The sun had fully risen now, October light slanting across the valley in that particular way that made even industrial sites look somehow beautiful. The raven that nested in the peak's crevices called out, a sound I'd come to associate with this place and this work. My father used to say that ravens were smarter than people gave them credit for, that they understood things about survival and adaptation that more conventionally impressive birds never learned. Maybe that was another lesson embedded in everything he'd left me. That intelligence wasn't always loud or obvious, that the most important wisdom often came quietly, that real understanding required patience and attention rather than quick conclusions. Raven's Peak hadn't looked valuable to anyone who made snap judgments based on surface appearance. It had required someone willing to look deeper, To study and document and trust that careful observation would reveal truths invisible to casual glances. I'd become that person, or at least I was becoming her. A project still in progress and likely to remain so for the rest of my life. My father hadn't left me a completed inheritance. He'd left me the raw materials and the tools and the faith that I could build something meaningful with what I'd been given. The actual building was my responsibility, my choice, my ongoing work. As I walked back to my car, passing the reclamation areas where native plants were being re-established and erosion barriers were allowing the land to heal even as extraction continued elsewhere on the property, I felt the weight of that responsibility. But it was a good weight, the kind that gave purpose and direction rather than simply burdening. My father had carried it for years, documenting and planning and preparing. Now it was mine, and I was proving every day that his faith hadn't been misplaced. The compass sat on my desk at home, in the study where I worked on foundation business and reviewed mining reports and planned for the decades of stewardship still ahead. Its needle still pointed true north, mechanical and certain, a physical reminder of the internal navigation my father had taught me to trust. Some people needed external validation to know they were heading the right direction. I'd learned to trust the internal compass that had been calibrated through years of watching my father read the earth with patience and respect. That evening, I returned to the cemetery as I did every few months, bringing fresh flowers and spending a quiet hour sitting beside the marker that glowed faintly in the dimming light. The bioluminescent coating had held up well, still catching and releasing light in the way my father had studied and documented all those years. It was a small memorial to a man who'd spent his life understanding how the natural world worked, who'd believed that paying attention mattered more than rushing to judgment. I brought something new this time. A bound copy of the 5-year impact report from the Robert Walker Foundation, documenting scholarships awarded, research funded, environmental projects completed. The numbers were impressive, but more impressive were the stories behind them. Students who discovered callings they never knew existed, research that was changing industry practices, communities that had access to clean energy because of investments made possible by careful stewardship of mineral wealth. "This is what you built, Dad," I said quietly, placing the report against the marker. Not just the documentation of what was under that land, but a framework for turning resources into lasting positive impact. "You gave me the map. I'm trying my best to honor the journey you had planned." A breeze moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of autumn and distant snow. Winter would come soon to Montana, the cycle continuing as it always had, indifferent to human drama and inheritance disputes and the small triumphs of people learning to become who they were meant to be. The land would endure long after the mining ceased, after the buildings crumbled, after everyone who'd fought over and celebrated and stewarded these 40 acres had returned to dust. But what we built on that foundation, the structures of meaning and purpose and responsibility, those had the potential to last in different ways. Through the students who carried forward the work, through the research that informed better practices, through the example of choosing depth over surface, patience over speed, integrity over expedience. My father had understood that this was the only kind of legacy worth pursuing, and he'd trusted me to understand it too, eventually, even when I couldn't see it clearly at first. I drove home as stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had guided my father during his surveys, that had illuminated the night sky when he'd worked late at the shack documenting his findings. Constant and reliable if you took the time to learn their language. If you understood that the most important navigations weren't the ones that got you somewhere fast, but the ones that got you somewhere worth being, even if the journey took longer than you'd planned. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with books about geology and mining and environmental science, with photos of the land at different seasons, with the accumulated evidence of a life built around purpose rather than just comfort. It wasn't the house Ryan had built with his inheritance, wasn't the showplace that announced success to everyone who saw it. But it was mine, and it reflected choices I'd made consciously, values I'd adopted deliberately, a life I'd constructed with the same care my father had brought to his surveys. Some people got houses, some got land, and if they were very lucky and paid very close attention, they got the wisdom to understand that what mattered wasn't what you inherited but what you built with it. My father had given me dirt and rocks and minerals worth millions. But more than that, he'd given me time to become someone worthy of that gift, faith that I'd figure out what really mattered, and tools to build something that would outlast us both. That was the inheritance that changed everything. Not the money, though the money helped. Not the land, though the land made it possible. But the trust, the belief, the quiet confidence that his daughter, the one everyone had underestimated, would prove to be exactly who he'd always known she could become. I was still proving it, still becoming her. Still learning what it meant to read the earth with patience and respect. But every day I got a little closer to the person my father had seen when he decided to leave me not what looked valuable, but what actually was. And that, more than any quarterly payment or foundation impact or reclaimed landscape, was the true measure of an inheritance well received and faithfully honored. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.